You think you know the men who run this city? Cold, untouchable, hearts pumping ice water. But what happens when the man who dictates life and death finds the one woman who holds his empire together, breaking apart on the midnight pavement? He wasn't supposed to care. She wasn't supposed to let him see. But at 12 o'clock on a Tuesday, the lines blur. Stick around, because loyalty is about to cost blood, and the truth is uglier than you think. Gideon Shaw didn't like the quiet. Quiet meant a job was finished, a debt was settled, or someone was waiting in the dark to put a bullet in his back. He preferred the hum of the servers, the frantic ringing of burner phones, the low, steady murmur of men who knew how to dispose of a problem. But at midnight on a Tuesday, the 64th floor of the Shaw Enterprises building was dead silent. He closed the ledger on his mahogany desk. The numbers matched. They always did. Gideon stood, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiff knot at the base of his neck. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down. Rain slicked the streets of the city, turning the asphalt into a black mirror, reflecting the harsh glare of neon signs. It was a miserable night, the kind of cold that seeped through wool and settled directly into the bones. He grabbed his overcoat, killed the lights, and stepped into the private elevator. The descent was a smooth, silent drop. When the doors parted at the ground floor lobby, the security guard sat up straight, nearly spilling a cup of tepid coffee. Gideon barely offered him a nod. He pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out into the biting wind. His driver, a giant of a man named Frank, was already idling the black town car at the curb. The exhaust plumed in thick white clouds against the damp air. Gideon reached for the door handle. Then he heard it. It wasn't a scream. A scream he would have ignored. Screams were common in his line of work. This was a ragged, sharp intake of breath, followed by a wet, choking sound. It came from the narrow alley, tucked between the glass facade of his building and the brick wall of the adjacent parking structure. Gideon paused. He let go of the door handle. Frank rolled down the window, his heavy brow furrowing. "Boss?" Gideon held up a single gloved hand. He turned his collar up against the freezing drizzle and walked toward the gap between the buildings. The only light came from a flickering halogen bulb caged in wire above a service door. Sitting on a damp concrete parking block, her knees pulled tight to her chest, was Tessa Brooks, his secretary. Gideon stopped. The cigar he had been anticipating for the last hour was forgotten in his pocket. He knew Tessa as a machine. She was a woman of sharp suits, tightly pinned hair, and a ruthless efficiency that rivaled his best lieutenants. She knew how to launder a schedule, how to placate angry politicians, and how to look directly at men carrying concealed weapons and ask them if they preferred cream or sugar. In 3 years, she had never been late. She had never stuttered. She had never shown a single crack. Now she was shivering violently. Her beige trench coat was soaked through at the shoulders. Her hair, normally a flawless blonde twist, hung in wet, limp strands across her face. She was rocking back and forth, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle the heavy, body-racking sobs tearing out of her throat. Gideon stood in the shadows. He didn't know what to do. If it were a man crying, he would have handed him a gun or a wad of cash and told him to fix it. If it were one of the women at his clubs, he would have told a manager to call a cab. But this was Tessa, the woman who handed him his black coffee at 7 in the morning and reminded him to call his estranged sister on her birthday. He stepped forward. His leather wingtips scraped against the gravel. Tessa flinched. She didn't just jump. She recoiled like a beaten dog, her head snapping up, eyes wide and terrified. The pale glow of the halogen light caught her face. Her mascara was smeared in dark streaks down her cheeks. "Mr. Shaw!" she gasped. The words came out fragmented, choked by the freezing air and her own panic. She scrambled to her feet. Her heel caught on the edge of the parking block, and she stumbled, catching herself against the wet brick wall. She immediately began swiping frantically at her face, trying to erase the evidence of her breakdown. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her teeth chattering loudly. I'm so sorry. I was just leaving. I just needed a minute. I'm sorry." Gideon didn't say anything. He looked at her hands. Her knuckles were stark white as she clutched a cheap, faux leather purse to her chest. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand straight. "It's 12:15, Gideon said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a fact. "I had to finish the quarterly projections," she lied. Her voice shook. It was a bad lie. Tessa always finished her work by 6. Gideon took another step into the alley. The cold rain was beginning to seep through his own coat, but he didn't feel it. He was focused entirely on the erratic, shallow rise and fall of her chest. "You're freezing," he said. "I'm fine. The bus it's coming, the night route. Just down the block." She tried to offer a professional smile. It was a grotesque failure, twisting her face into a grimace of pure exhaustion. "Good night, Mr. Shaw." She tried to walk past him. Gideon reached out. He didn't grab her. He just put his arm across the narrow space of the alley, blocking her path. She stopped short, her breath hitching. He looked down at her. She was avoiding his eyes, staring fixedly at the silk tie resting against his chest. "Frank is out front," Gideon said quietly. "Get in the car." "No, really, I can't." "Tessa." He used her first name. He rarely did that. The sound of it seemed to physically jolt her. "Get in the car." The interior of the town car smelled of expensive leather, faint cigar smoke, and heavy-duty heating. Gideon sat on the passenger side, leaving a wide gap between them on the bench seat. Tessa sat pressed against the opposite door, making herself as small as possible. She kept her knees locked together, her wet hands folded tightly in her lap. Frank put the car in drive, smoothly pulling away from the curb. The wipers thumped a rhythmic, hypnotic beat against the windshield. "Turn the heat up, Frank," Gideon ordered. "Already on max, boss." Gideon reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded, clean white cotton handkerchief. He tossed it onto the empty leather space between them. "Fix your face," he said, staring straight ahead at the partition. Tessa stared at the handkerchief like it was a trap. After a long moment, she reached out with trembling fingers, picked it up, and dabbed at her eyes. She scrubbed at the ruined makeup, pulling her wet hair back and tucking it behind her ears. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual crisp authority. "Where do you live?" "South Side, Elm and 42nd. But you can just drop me at the subway station, Mr. Shaw. Please. I don't want to take you out of your way." Gideon ignored her. "Elm and 42nd, he repeated to Frank. Frank nodded, turning the heavy wheel to navigate toward the on-ramp. Silence descended on the cabin. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was dense, thick with the unsaid. Gideon watched the city bleed past the tinted windows. He was an observer by nature. He noticed the way a man held a pen to see if he was left-handed. He noticed the scuff on a rival's shoe that meant he was careless. "Now," he observed Tessa in the reflection of the glass. She was shivering less, the heavy heat of the car finally cutting through her wet clothes. But her breathing was still wrong, too shallow. She was holding onto her purse with a grip so tight her fingers looked bloodless. Then her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. It was a harsh, vibrating rattle against the fabric. Tessa flinched as if she had been struck. She didn't reach for it. She just stared down at her lap, her jaw clenching tight. It buzzed again. And again. 3 rapid, aggressive bursts. Gideon turned his head slowly. "You going to answer that?" "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. "It's just telemarketers. Late-night spam. At 12:30 in the morning." "Yes." Gideon let out a slow breath. He shifted his weight, turning slightly toward her. He rested his elbows on the armrest, his dark eyes locking onto her pale face. "Tessa," he said softly. She swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Shaw? In 3 years, have I ever asked you about your personal life?" She shook her head, keeping her eyes down. "No, sir. Have I ever been unfair to you? Shorted your pay? Asked you to do something outside the scope of your employment? No, never. Good. Then understand this isn't a conversation between a boss and a secretary." He paused, letting the low rumble of the engine fill the space. "Who is making you cry in an alley in the freezing rain?" Tessa let out a shaky breath. She closed her eyes. "It's nothing. Just personal stress. The holidays are coming up, and my apartment had a leak, and I had a moment, a weak moment. I'm sorry you had to see it. It won't affect my work." Gideon reached across the seat. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to pull away. He took hold of her hands. Tessa froze. Her skin was still ice cold. Gideon gently pried her hands apart. He wasn't looking at her purse. He was looking at her right wrist. The sleeve of her damp trench coat had pulled back slightly, just enough to reveal the skin just above her watch band. The skin was mottled with an ugly, dark purple bruise. The shape of it was distinct. 4 oval marks on one side, a larger thumb-shaped mark on the other. Someone had grabbed her, hard enough to burst blood vessels. Gideon's thumb brushed lightly over the edge of the bruise. Tessa gasped and jerked her hand back, pulling her sleeve down frantically. The air in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gideon's face didn't change. His expression remained utterly impassive. But a dark, violent gravity settled into his eyes. "Frank," Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yeah, boss? Take the next exit. Pull into the diner on 9th, the one with the broken sign." "Mr. Shaw, no, please. I just want to go home," Tessa pleaded, panic rising in her chest again. "You're not going home," Gideon stated flatly. "Not until you tell me whose handprint is on your arm." The diner was a hollow shell of faded vinyl and flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled heavily of burnt grease and stale coffee. They were the only customers. A bored waitress in a pink uniform sat at the far end of the counter, scrolling on her phone. She looked up, took one look at Gideon's expensive wool coat and the cold, dead look in his eyes, and decided they didn't need menus. She just brought a pot of decaf and 2 thick ceramic mugs, then practically ran back to her stool. Gideon sat in the booth, his back straight against the cracked red vinyl. Tessa sat across from him. She kept her coat on. She wrapped her hands around the hot mug, absorbing the heat, staring into the dark liquid like it held the secrets of the universe. Gideon didn't touch his cup. He just watched her. "Drink," he commanded softly. She took a small sip. Her hands were still shaking, making the ceramic clatter lightly against her teeth. "I don't belong in your world, Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the diner's old refrigerator. "I balance the books. I schedule your flights. I don't know what you do at night, and I don't want to know. I stay out of it." "You do," Gideon agreed. "You're smart, smarter than half the men on my payroll. Then let me stay out of it." She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, full of a desperate, pleading exhaustion. "Don't ask me questions. Please, just let me go to work tomorrow and pretend tonight didn't happen." "I can't do that, Tessa." "Why not?" she snapped, a sudden spark of anger breaking through her fear. "Because you're curious? Because it offended your ego to see your perfect machine malfunctioning on your property?" Gideon didn't flinch. He let her anger wash over him. "Because," he said evenly, "someone put their hands on you, and you are mine." Tessa blinked, taken aback by the blunt possessiveness of the statement. "I am your employee. You are under my protection," he corrected her. "Whether you asked for it or not. The people in this city know who you work for. which means whoever bruised your arm either doesn't know you work for me, or they don't care. Both options are a problem for them. Tessa slumped back against the booth. The fight drained out of her instantly, leaving only a hollow shell. She let out a long, ragged sigh, resting her forehead in her hands. "It won't fix anything," she mumbled. "Try me." She stayed quiet for a long minute. The neon sign outside buzzed loudly, casting a sickly red glow across the table. "My father," she began, her voice flat, devoid of emotion now. The dam had broken, and now she was just surveying the wreckage. "He was a gambler. Not a good one. He died 3 years ago. Heart attack." Gideon nodded slowly. He knew this. It was in her background check before he hired her. "He left us with nothing, just a mortgaged house and a lot of angry people knocking on the door. My sister, Clara, she was only 19. She didn't know what she was doing. She tried to fix it. She went to some people to borrow money to pay off the immediate debts, thinking she could work it off before the interest hit." Tessa let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. "She went to a loan shark, Mr. Shaw. A bad one. She borrowed $30,000. In 2 years, with their penalties and interest, they claim she owes them $150. Gideon's jaw tightened. "Who holds the paper?" Tessa shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Tessa, give me a name." "The Morelli crew," she whispered, looking terrified just saying the words out loud. Gideon didn't react outwardly, but inside, a cold, calculating fury ignited. The Morellis were scavengers, bottom feeders who operated on the fringes of his territory, running extortion rackets and preying on the desperate. They were useful idiots, paying up the chain to one of Gideon's lieutenants. They were indirect subordinates. They were eating scraps from Gideon's table. "They called her today," Tessa continued, a tear slipping down her cheek, cutting through the smeared makeup. "They told her time was up, that they were coming to collect the collateral. They said if she didn't have the money, she was going to have to work it off. In one of their houses." Gideon felt his blood run cold. "I took everything I had," she said, her voice cracking. "My savings, my 401k, the rent money, $12,000. I found their collector tonight after work. I begged him to take it as a good faith payment, to give us another month." She touched her bruised wrist unconsciously. "He took the money. Then he pushed me into a wall. He told me $12,000 covers the interest for the week. He said they're still coming for Clara on Friday." She looked at Gideon, her face an open wound of grief and absolute despair. "I have nothing left. I don't know what to do. I can't let them take her." Gideon sat perfectly still. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. She had spent 3 years organizing his life, shielding him from annoyances, making sure his empire ran smoothly. While she did that, she had been drowning in the dark, suffocated by the very filth he controlled. He didn't just know the Morellis. He owned the building where they ran their illegal books. Gideon stood up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it on the table. Tessa looked up, panicked. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" "Come on," Gideon said, his voice hard, sharp, echoing with absolute authority. "We're leaving." "Where?" Gideon looked down at her. The mask of the polished businessman was completely gone. In its place was the ruthless, terrifying apex predator of the city's underworld. "To make a phone call," he said. "Friday is cancelled." The town car swallowed the noise of the city, turning the chaotic streets of the financial district into a muted, rushing blur of wet neon. Frank navigated the slick asphalt with heavy-footed precision. In the back, the silence was a physical weight. Tessa sat staring at the partition, her hands finally steady, though her chest felt hollowed out. She had broken the cardinal rule of surviving the corporate underbelly. She had made her problem his problem. Gideon didn't look at her. He pulled a slim, encrypted satellite phone from his inner coat pocket. He didn't scroll through a contact list. He dialed a sequence of numbers from memory, his thumb moving in sharp, angry strikes. He held the phone to his ear. 1 ring, 2. Yeah. The voice on the other end was rough, thick with sleep. "Wake up, Donovan," Gideon said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal, freezing resonance that made Tessa's breath catch. There was a shuffle of fabric over the line. When Donovan spoke again, the sleep was gone. "I'm up, boss. What broke?" "The Morelli operation. Down in the East End." Gideon stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked rapidly beneath his jawline. Who runs their paper? Old man Morelli, officially. But his nephew, Sal, handles the street-level collections. Shakedowns, high-interest loans, leveraging desperation. Small fry stuff. They kick up 10% on the first of the month. Donovan paused. "Did they miss a payment?" "They did worse," Gideon said softly. "They touched something that belongs to me." Tessa closed her eyes, the words wrapping around her throat like a velvet wire. "Belongs to me." It wasn't romantic. It was a statement of territorial absolute. In Gideon Shaw's world, you did not touch his money, his supply lines, or his people. "Give me the address of their counting room," Gideon ordered. "The meatpacking district. Old refrigeration warehouse on 11th and Gansevoort," Donovan replied instantly. "You want me to send a crew to shut them down?" "No. Send a car to Elm and 42nd, ground floor apartment. There is a girl there named Clara. Bring her to the penthouse at the St. Regis. Put 4 men on the door. If anyone who isn't you or me tries to walk through that frame, shoot them." Tessa gasped, leaning forward. "Mr. Shaw, no, you don't have to move her." Gideon raised a finger, cutting her off without looking at her. "Do it, Donovan, then meet me at Gansevoort." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat. "Frank," Gideon said, leaning forward slightly. "Change of destination. The St. Regis first. Then drop me at Gansevoort." "Copy that, boss." Tessa turned to him, her panic flaring back to life. "Gideon, please." It was the first time she had used his first name. It slipped out by accident, dragged up by raw desperation. "You're going to start a war over a secretary. They're going to know. The police, the other families. You can't just blow up a crew over a bad debt." Gideon finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes were bottomless, stripping away the polished veneer of the CEO she had known for 3 years. This was the man who had clawed his way out of the gutters of the city, building an empire on blood and leverage. "I am not starting a war, Tessa," he said evenly. "Wars are fought between equals. The Morellis are pests in the walls. I'm calling an exterminator." "They have guns," she whispered. "Sal is crazy. He's the one who took the money. He laughed when he pushed me." Gideon's gaze dropped to her wrist, where the sleeve of her coat covered the bruise. "He won't laugh again." The car pulled up to the gilded awning of the St. Regis. The doorman, recognizing the plates, immediately snapped to attention, pulling the heavy brass doors open. "Get out," Gideon instructed. "Go up to the penthouse. The concierge has the key waiting. Frank will walk you to the elevator." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her fingers gripping the door handle. "I'm going to balance a ledger." Gideon looked at her, his expression softening by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the closest thing to a comforting look she had ever seen on his face. "Go upstairs. Order room service. Wait for your sister. I will handle the rest." Tessa hesitated, caught between the urge to run and the strange, terrifying gravity that pulled her toward him. She swallowed hard, stepped out into the freezing rain, and let Frank guide her into the glowing warmth of the hotel lobby. Gideon watched her go until the brass doors swung shut. "Gansevoort," he told the new driver who had slipped into the front seat, "and step on it." The warehouse on 11th and Gansevoort smelled of copper, rotting ice, and cheap cigar smoke. The heavy steel roll-up door was pulled down shut, but a small side entrance remained, propped open by a cinder block. Donovan was waiting in the shadows of the alley. He was a broad-shouldered man with a scarred jawline and a heavy wool coat that poorly concealed the submachine gun slung across his chest. 3 other men stood behind him, silent and still as statues. "Boss," Donovan nodded as Gideon stepped out of the car. Gideon buttoned his overcoat, stepping over a puddle of murky water. "Are they inside?" "6 of them. Sal is at the table. They're counting the day's take." "Oh, good." Gideon didn't wait for his men. He walked through the propped-open door, his leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the damp concrete. Donovan and the crew fanned out behind him, stepping into the dim, cavernous space. The warehouse was a graveyard of rusted meat hooks and hanging chains. In the center of the room, beneath the harsh glare of a single, swinging industrial light bulb, sat a folding table. Stacks of dirty bills, baggies of cheap narcotics, and a scattered deck of cards littered the surface. Sal Morelli sat at the head of the table. He was wearing a track suit, a gold chain resting against his chest. He was holding up a thick stack of $100 bills, flicking them with his thumb, and laughing at a joke one of his men had just told. 12 grand, Sal sneered, tossing the stack onto the table. Dumb bitch actually brought it in a grocery bag, crying about her little sister. I told her, "Sweetheart, this just keeps the lights on for the week. Friday, we take the girl." The men around the table laughed. It was an ugly, grating sound. "Is that right?" Gideon's voice echoed through the freezing room. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, conversational tone that sliced through the laughter like a scalpel. The 6 men at the table froze. Sal whipped around, his hand dropping instinctively toward the waistband of his sweatpants. Before any of them could draw, Donovan and the 3 enforcers stepped out of the shadows, lifting their weapons. The metallic clacks of safeties being switched off echoed off the cinder block walls. Sal's hand stopped dead. The blood drained from his face as his eyes adjusted to the dim light and recognized the man standing 20 feet away. "Mr. Shaw," Sal breathed, his voice cracking. He stood up so fast his metal folding chair tipped backward, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. "Gideon, boss, we didn't know you were coming down. We would have—" He trailed off, looking at the assault rifles leveled at his chest. Gideon walked slowly toward the table. He didn't look at the other 5 men. He kept his eyes locked on Sal. "You had a profitable night, Sal," Gideon said, stopping at the edge of the table. He looked down at the stacks of cash, his eyes resting on the neat bundle of $100 bills bound in a blue rubber band. Tessa's money. "Yeah, just collecting some outstanding paper," Sal stammered, holding his hands up placatingly. "You know how it is. Market's tough. Got to squeeze the lemons." "Lemons," Gideon repeated softly. "Yeah." Sal swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead, despite the freezing temperature of the room. "Is there a problem, Mr. Shaw? Did the kickback not clear?" Gideon slowly reached out and picked up the bundle of money bound in the blue rubber band. He weighed it in his hand. $12,000. The entirety of Tessa's savings. Her blood, sweat, and desperate tears condensed into a stack of dirty paper. "You run a sloppy book, Sal," Gideon said. "You lend to people who can't pay. You inflate interest beyond the agreed territory limits, and you threaten women who have absolutely nothing to do with this life." Sal's eyes darted nervously to the money in Gideon's hand, realization dawning with sickening speed. "The blonde, the secretary. Her name is Tessa," Gideon said. Sal took a step back, hitting the edge of the table. "I swear to God, Mr. Shaw, I didn't know she was with you. She didn't say nothing. She just said she was paying for her sister. I didn't touch her, I swear." "You're lying." Gideon moved with a sudden, terrifying blur of speed. He grabbed Sal by the thick gold chain around his neck and slammed him face first into the folding table. The wood splintered. Cash and drugs scattered onto the filthy floor. Sal screamed, a high, reedy sound, as Gideon pinned his head to the table with a heavy forearm. The 5 other thugs flinched, but Donovan's crew stepped forward, pressing the barrels of their rifles into the backs of their heads. Nobody moved. "Which hand?" Gideon asked. His voice was a calm, dead whisper, directly into Sal's ear. "What? Please, God, no. Which hand did you use to push her into the wall?" "I didn't! She fell! She slipped on the ice!" Sal sobbed, struggling uselessly against the crushing weight, pressing him into the splinters. Gideon didn't ask again. He reached down and grabbed Sal's right arm, hauling it up behind his back. He gripped the man's wrist, the exact place where the dark, oval bruises had bloomed on Tessa's pale skin. "This is the new math, Sal," Gideon said quietly. "The debt is clear. The ledger is burned. If you, your uncle, or anyone in your miserable crew ever speaks the name Brooks again, I won't send men with guns. I will come myself. And I will burn you alive inside this freezer." Gideon twisted. The snap of bone was a loud, dry crack that echoed up into the vaulted ceiling. Sal shrieked, his legs giving out, collapsing to the floor as Gideon released him. He curled into a fetal position, clutching his mangled, rapidly swelling wrist, weeping openly onto the concrete. Gideon stood over him, utterly unmoved. He straightened his tie. He picked up the bundle of $12,000 from the floor, brushed a speck of dirt off the top bill, and slid it into his coat pocket. He looked at the 5 terrified thugs, standing perfectly still with guns to their heads. "Pick him up," Gideon commanded. "Take him to a hospital, then tell your uncle he operates in the Bronx now. He has 24 hours to vacate my city." Gideon turned his back on the room and walked out into the freezing rain. The violence hadn't calmed the storm inside him. If anything, the smell of fear and the sound of breaking bone only highlighted the contrast between his world and Tessa's. He had fixed the problem. But as he got into the waiting car, he knew, with a dark, sinking certainty, that he hadn't fixed it for her. He had fixed it for himself. Because the thought of someone hurting her was a liability he could not afford to leave breathing. The penthouse suite of the St. Regis was a sprawling expanse of ivory silk, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the storm battering the city skyline. Tessa stood by the window, staring out at the rain. She had taken off her wet trench coat and shoes, pacing the plush carpet in her damp skirt and blouse. A pot of chamomile tea sat untouched on the glass coffee table. In the master bedroom, the door cracked open. Clara was asleep. Donovan's men had retrieved the 19-year-old just as the panic had set in. Clara had cried, apologized 100 times, and finally collapsed into an exhausted sleep on the king-sized bed. Tessa couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the last 3 hours on an endless, terrifying loop. She had crossed an invisible line. She had let the darkness of her personal life bleed into the sterile, controlled environment of Shaw Enterprises. And Gideon Shaw had stepped out of the boardroom and revealed the monster he kept chained in the basement. The soft click of the electronic lock made her jump. The heavy oak door swung open. Gideon stepped into the foyer. He was alone. He shucked off his wet overcoat, hanging it on a brass hook with methodical precision. Tessa held her breath. He looked exactly the same as he had when he left. His tailored suit was immaculate. His hair was perfectly in place. But the air around him had changed. It was charged, heavy with a brutal, predatory energy that hadn't yet settled back beneath the surface. He walked into the living room, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "She's asleep," Tessa said quickly, pointing toward the bedroom door. Her voice sounded thin, fragile against the sprawling silence of the suite. "I know," Gideon said. He walked over to the wet bar, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a heavy glass, and drank it neat. He set the glass down with a soft clink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the bundle of cash wrapped in the blue rubber band. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed next to the teacup with a heavy thud. Tessa stared at it. "What is that?" "Your savings," Gideon said. Her breath hitched. She took a step toward the table, her eyes wide. Did you pay them?" "The debt is cancelled," Gideon replied, his tone flat. He didn't offer details. He wouldn't saddle her with the burden of knowing what a man sounded like when his wrist shattered. "They won't look for Clara. They won't look for you. They don't exist anymore." Tessa looked from the money to his face. She searched his eyes, looking for a trace of a lie, a hint of a hidden cost. She found nothing but a dark, immovable wall. "Just like that," she whispered. "Just like that." Tessa sank onto the edge of the velvet sofa. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright for the last 24 hours abruptly vanished, leaving her hollow and shaking. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a long, ragged breath. It wasn't a sob. It was the sound of a survivor realizing the war was suddenly, impossibly over. Gideon watched her. He was accustomed to gratitude taking the form of loyalty, fear, or a share of profits. He wasn't accustomed to the raw, unfiltered relief radiating from the woman sitting in front of him. He walked around the coffee table and sat on the sofa beside her. He didn't sit too close, leaving a respectable distance between them, but his presence was undeniable. A wall of heat and quiet authority. "You should sleep," Gideon said. Tessa lowered her hands. She looked at him, her eyes tracing the harsh lines of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble on his cheeks. She looked down at his hands. His knuckles on his right hand were red, the skin slightly grazed, a stark contrast to the perfect French cuffs of his shirt. Without thinking, moving purely on the instinct of a woman who had spent 3 years fixing his problems, Tessa reached out. She gently took his right hand in hers. Gideon went entirely still. Every muscle in his body pulled taut. Men who touched him without permission usually lost the offending limb. But her touch was incredibly light, her cool fingers tracing the angry red marks on his knuckles. "You hurt yourself," she said softly. "It's nothing." His voice dropped an octave, a rough gravel sound that resonated in the quiet room. "Nothing in your world is nothing," Tessa replied, her thumb brushing over the graze. She wasn't an idiot. She knew exactly how he had gotten the money back. She knew violence was the currency he traded in. But sitting here, in the quiet aftermath, she didn't feel afraid of him. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "What is the cost, Gideon?" He frowned slightly. "The cost of what?" "This." She gestured to the room, the money, the safety. "You don't do favors. You make investments. I know how you operate. So tell me what I owe you, because I can't pay this back on a secretary's salary." Gideon stared at her. For a moment, the mask cracked. A flicker of genuine irritation crossed his features, quickly replaced by something much darker, much more dangerous. He turned his hand over, catching her wrist. He didn't grab the bruised side. He held her gently, his long fingers wrapping around her pulse point. It was beating frantically against his skin. "You think I did this to put you in my debt?" he asked softly. "I think you don't do anything for free." Gideon leaned in. The distance between them closed, the scent of rain, expensive cologne, and danger wrapping around her. "I did it because I had to," Gideon said, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "Because the thought of you sitting in the freezing rain, crying over scavengers who aren't fit to breathe the same air as you, made me want to burn this city to the bedrock." Tessa stopped breathing. "You don't owe me money, Tessa," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her racing pulse. "Owe me your honesty. No more secrets, no more hiding in alleys. She swallowed hard, her mind spinning. The safe, professional boundaries that had governed their lives for 3 years were disintegrating into ash. "I can't be part of your world, Gideon. I can't handle the blood." "You already are part of it," he corrected her, his voice a relentless, hypnotic drawl. "You're the only part of it that's clean, and I am going to keep you that way." He let go of her wrist, standing up in one fluid motion. The sudden loss of his heat left a freezing void in the air between them. "Take a few days off," Gideon commanded, the CEO mask sliding back into place, though the cracks were now visible. "Stay here as long as you need. The account is open. Get some sleep, Miss Brooks." He turned and walked toward the door. Tessa watched him leave. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing her in the quiet luxury of the penthouse. She looked at the $12,000 on the table. She had her life back. Her sister was safe. The monster at the door had been slaughtered, but as she touched her own pulse, still racing from the heat of his grip, Tessa realized a much more terrifying truth. She hadn't escaped the dark. She had just been claimed by the king of it. Monday morning arrived with the brutal, blinding glare of a winter sun reflecting off the city's skyscrapers. The 64th floor of Shaw Enterprises hummed with its usual predatory efficiency. Phones rang, keyboards clattered. Men in bespoke suits paced the carpeted hallways, trading millions of dollars in futures and hostile takeovers. It was a well-oiled machine, functioning exactly as it had for years. But behind the frosted glass of the CEO's office, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a vacuum. Tessa stood in the small kitchenette attached to Gideon's suite, watching the dark liquid of his espresso drip into a porcelain cup. She was wearing a charcoal pencil skirt and a high-collared silk blouse. Her blonde hair was pinned back in its customary twist. From a distance, she was exactly the same machine she had always been. But up close, the cracks were visible. The dark circles under her eyes couldn't be completely hidden by concealer. Her movements were rigid, excessively controlled, as if she were afraid that relaxing a single muscle would cause her to collapse into a pile of ash. The bruise on her right wrist was hidden beneath the silk cuff, but she could feel it. It throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She placed the espresso on a silver tray alongside the morning's Financial Digest and a silver pen. She smoothed her skirt, took a slow, deep breath, and pushed the heavy oak door open. Gideon was at his desk. He didn't look up. He was reading a printed contract, his pen poised to strike out a clause. He wore a navy suit today. The cut was aggressive, the shoulders broad, the fabric immaculate. He looked like a man who spent his weekends at country clubs, not breaking bones in freezing meatpacking warehouses. Tessa walked across the thick carpet. Her heels made no sound. She set the tray on the corner of his desk. "Your 9 o'clock with the board is prepped," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, professional, crisp. "The quarterly reports are in the blue folder. I've highlighted the discrepancies in the offshore accounts. They tried to hide a 3% skim in the logistics column." Gideon finally stopped writing. He didn't look at the tray. He looked at her. His dark eyes tracked over her face, taking in the pale skin, the rigid posture, the sheer force of will it took for her to stand there and pretend the world hadn't shifted on its axis. "You shouldn't be here," Gideon said. His voice was low, carrying beneath the faint hum of the ventilation system. "It's Monday, Mr. Shaw. I work on Mondays. I told you to take the week. I told you to stay at the hotel. Clara is at the hotel. She is safe. The men at the door are very thorough," Tessa replied, keeping her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But I cannot sit in a silk bathrobe and stare at the wall for 5 days. If I stop moving, I will lose my mind. I need to work." Gideon leaned back in his leather chair. He studied her. He understood the instinct. Work was armor. Routine was a barricade against trauma. He had built his entire empire on that exact principle. "They know who you are now, Tessa," he said bluntly. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't offer false comforts. Sal Morelli is in a hospital with a shattered arm, and his uncle is packing his bags for the Bronx. Word travels. The people who pay me and the people who want to kill me now know that the secretary is a protected asset. You are on the board." Tessa swallowed hard. The sterile, air-conditioned air of the office suddenly felt thin. "I stay in the building. I take the private elevator. I go home in the company car. Frank doesn't leave your side. If you go to the ground floor for a coffee, he goes with you." "Understood. And you don't go back to Elm Street. I have men clearing the apartment. Everything you and your sister own will be moved to a secure building in Midtown by tomorrow." Tessa's composure slipped. Just a fraction. Her jaw tightened, a flash of genuine rebellion sparking in her tired eyes. "My mother's things are in that apartment. Photographs, jewelry, things your men won't recognize as valuable. I have to pack them myself." "No," the word was absolute, a steel door slamming shut. "Gideon." "Mr. Shaw," he corrected her sharply. The sudden formality was a weapon, designed to force her back behind the professional boundary she was trying to cross. "In this building, I am Mr. Shaw, and I am telling you, as your employer and the man keeping you breathing, you do not go back to Elm Street." Tessa stared at him. The heat rushed to her face, a mix of humiliation and anger. He was right. He had saved her. He owned the debt. He owned the safety. She was entirely at his mercy. "Is there anything else you need before your meeting, Mr. Shaw?" she asked, her voice dropping 20 degrees. Gideon looked at her for a long, silent moment. His jaw worked, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. He hated the fear in her eyes, but he hated her defiance more, because her defiance would get her killed. "No," he said quietly. "That will be all, Miss Brooks." Tessa turned on her heel and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. Gideon sat alone in the quiet office. He looked at the espresso on the silver tray. He picked it up and drank it in one shot. It was bitter, scalding, and tasted exactly like ashes. He threw the porcelain cup into the metal wastebasket. It shattered with a sharp, satisfying crack. He had spent his entire life building walls. He had insulated himself with money, power, and violence. He didn't care about the collateral damage of his business. He didn't care about the lives ruined by the numbers on his ledgers. But the woman on the other side of the glass was different. She was a liability, a gaping hole in his armor. And the worst part wasn't that she was vulnerable. The worst part was that Gideon Shaw knew, with absolute certainty, that he would burn his own empire to the ground before he let anyone touch her again. Tessa lasted until Wednesday. By midweek, the suffocating presence of the security detail and the sterile perfection of the hotel had driven her to a state of quiet panic. She felt like a ghost, haunting her own life. Clara was enrolled in online classes, completely oblivious to the depth of the danger they had just narrowly avoided, happily ordering room service on Gideon's dime. Tessa needed something real. She needed the smell of her mother's old books. She needed the cheap, chipped coffee mugs she had bought at a thrift store when she first moved to the city. She needed proof that she was still a person, not just a protected asset in Gideon Shaw's vault. At 3 p.m, she told Frank she was going down to the lobby pharmacy to buy aspirin. Frank, a giant of a man who rarely spoke, nodded and stood by the elevator bank. Tessa walked into the pharmacy, went straight out the back service exit, flagged a yellow cab, and gave the driver the address for Elm Street. It was a stupid, reckless move. She knew it the moment she stepped onto the cracked pavement of her old neighborhood. The air here didn't smell like rain and expensive leather. It smelled of stale beer, exhaust fumes, and damp trash. She walked quickly to the brownstone, her keys clutched tightly in her fist. The front door of this building was propped open with a brick. She hurried down the narrow, dimly lit hallway to apartment 1B. She slid the key into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. The lock was entirely broken, the metal casing splintered. The door was already cracked open by a fraction of an inch. Tessa froze. The blood drained from her head, leaving a cold, high-pitched ringing in her ears. She should have run. She should have turned around, walked back to the street, and called Frank. But a visceral, territorial anger surged up through her fear. This was her home. These were her things. She pushed the door open. The apartment was destroyed. The cheap sofa was slashed, the stuffing pulled out in white, fluffy clumps. The small television was smashed on the floor. Her books, her mother's books, were swept off the shelves, their spines broken, pages torn and scattered across the cheap linoleum. "Look at this!" a voice rasped from the shadows of the small kitchen. The little bird flew back to the cage. Tessa stumbled backward, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. A man stepped out of the kitchen. He wasn't Sal Morelli. He was older, heavier, with a thick beard and a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. He wore a heavy leather jacket and held a rusted crowbar in his right hand. This was Old Man Morelli's response. He couldn't touch Gideon Shaw. He couldn't fight a war against the king. But he could send a scavenger to trash a defenseless apartment and leave a message. "You got a lot of nerve, sweetheart," the man grunted, tapping the crowbar against his leg. "My boss lost his nephew's right hand because of you. He lost his territory. He's operating out of a rat hole in the Bronx now." Tessa's back hit the doorframe. Her purse slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Get out," she managed to say. Her voice shook, but she didn't scream. "No, I don't think I will. I was just supposed to leave a mess. But finding you here, that's a bonus. We're going to send Shaw a little message. Show him what happens when he steps on the little guys." He lunged forward. Tessa didn't freeze. The 3 days of pent-up anxiety, the suffocating fear, the humiliation of being a pawn, it all snapped. As the man reached for her, she grabbed the heavy brass lamp sitting on the entry table and swung it with everything she had. The heavy metal base caught the man square in the jaw. He grunted, stumbling sideways, dropping the crowbar as his hands flew to his face. Blood immediately poured from his split lip. Tessa didn't wait. She bolted for the door. She made it exactly 2 steps into the hallway before a massive hand clamped down on the back of her coat, yanking her violently backward. She slammed into the wall, the breath knocked out of her lungs in a sharp gasp. The man pinned her against the peeling wallpaper, his forearm crushing against her collarbone. His breath smelled of stale tobacco and copper. "You stupid bitch," he snarled, raising a heavy fist. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. It never came. A deafening roar echoed in the narrow hallway. It sounded like a cannon going off. The pressure on Tessa's chest vanished instantly. The man's grip was torn away with brutal, terrifying force. Tessa slumped to the floor, gasping for air, her eyes flying open. Donovan stood in the doorway. He hadn't fired a gun. The sound had been his heavy boot kicking the wooden door entirely off its hinges, slamming it into the wall. Donovan grabbed the heavy-set man by the collar of his leather jacket, lifted him a full 6 inches off the ground, and drove him head-first into the plaster wall. The drywall cracked under the impact. The man dropped to the floor, completely unconscious, bleeding heavily from his forehead. Donovan didn't even look at the body. He stepped over it, his eyes scanning the hallway, a suppressed pistol gripped loosely in his right hand. Frank came running down the hall a second later, breathing heavily, his suit jacket flapping. "Are you hit?" Donovan asked Tessa. His voice was completely devoid of panic. It was a tactical assessment. "No," Tessa choked out, pulling herself up by the doorframe. Her legs were shaking so violently she could barely stand. "I'm okay." Frank let out a string of vicious curses, running a hand over his bald head. "Jesus Christ, Miss Brooks. You went out the back of the pharmacy. Do you have any idea what he's going to do to me?" "He's not going to do anything to you," a third voice said. The temperature in the hallway seemed to plummet. Gideon Shaw stood at the end of the corridor. He didn't walk. He stalked. His overcoat flared around his legs, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. The men in his employ stepped back, pressing themselves against the walls to give him a wide berth. He stopped in front of Tessa. He didn't look at the unconscious man bleeding on the floor. He didn't look at Donovan or Frank. He looked only at her. "Mr. Shaw, Tessa started, her voice breaking. Gideon grabbed her arm. Not gently. His grip was tight, possessive, pulling her away from the wreckage of the apartment. "Donovan, clean this up," Gideon ordered over his shoulder. "If he wakes up, ask him who sent him, then put him in the river." "Understood, boss." Gideon dragged Tessa down the hallway, out the front door, and into the waiting town car. He shoved her into the back seat, sliding in right behind her. Frank practically dove into the driver's seat and threw the car in gear. The doors locked with a sharp, heavy click. Tessa shrank against the leather seat, clutching her ruined coat. She had seen Gideon angry. She had seen him violent. But this was different. This was a dark, suffocating rage that seemed to consume the oxygen in the cabin. "I told you," Gideon said. His voice was barely a whisper. It was a deadly, serrated edge. "I told you not to go back." "They were my mother's things," Tessa fired back, the adrenaline making her reckless. She turned to face him, her chest heaving. "I just wanted my mother's pictures. I wanted something that belonged to me." "Nothing belongs to you anymore," Gideon roared. The sheer volume of his voice shook the windows. Frank flinched in the front seat. Tessa pressed herself flat against the door, her eyes wide with shock. Gideon leaned forward, invading her space, his hands planting heavily on the seat on either side of her shoulders, trapping her in. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were completely black, stripped of all humanity, leaving only the predator behind. "Do you understand what you did?" he demanded, his breath hot against her face. "You walked into an unsecured box. You made yourself bait. You think this is a game? You think because I broke one man's arm that the rest of them just disappear?" "I didn't think they would come back," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and cutting a warm path down her freezing cheek. "They will always come back," Gideon said, his voice dropping back to a harsh, ragged whisper. "They will look for the weakness. They will look for the crack in the armor. And right now, Tessa, you are the only crack I have." He stared at her mouth, then up to her terrified eyes. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. "Frank," Gideon said without looking away from her. "Yeah, boss?" "Take us to the estate." Tessa's breath caught. "No, the hotel. Clara is at the hotel." "Clara will be brought to the estate," Gideon corrected her. He finally pulled back, resting against the opposite door, but his eyes never left hers. "The hotel is a public building. The estate is a fortress. You are not leaving my sight again." The Shaw estate sat on 60 acres of fortified woodland 30 miles outside the city limits. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of dark stone, reinforced glass, and heavy steel. 12-foot iron gates, cameras on every tree line, and men patrolling the perimeter with automatic weapons. It wasn't a home, it was a compound. The town car pulled up to the massive oak front doors. Gideon got out first. He didn't wait for Frank to open her door. He opened it himself, offering his hand. Tessa looked at his outstretched palm. It was the hand that held the pen that moved millions. It was the hand that shattered bone. She took it. He led her inside. The interior was cavernous, minimalist and deeply cold. Black slate floors, dark leather furniture, a massive stone fireplace that stood empty. It felt entirely devoid of human warmth. "Clara will be put in the east wing," Gideon said, shucking off his coat and tossing it onto a chair. "It has its own kitchen, a media room. She won't have to interact with the security staff." Tessa stood in the center of the massive foyer, her arms wrapped around herself. The fight was gone. The adrenaline crash had hit her hard, leaving her bones feeling like lead. "And where will I be?" she asked quietly. Gideon stopped walking. He turned slowly, the heavy silence of the house pressing down around them. "You will be with me," he said. Tessa looked around the empty, cavernous room. "I'm a prisoner here. You are safe here." "It's the same thing." Gideon walked back toward her. He closed the distance slowly, deliberately, until he was standing right in front of her. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Take off your coat," he ordered. Tessa hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned the ruined trench coat, letting it slip off her shoulders. It pooled on the dark slate floor. Gideon reached out, his large hands gripped her shoulders. His touch was firm, grounding, sending a shock of heat through her freezing body. He dragged his thumbs along her collarbone, feeling the rapid, panicked flutter of her pulse. "You want the truth, Tessa?" he asked, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register. "Yes. The truth is, I spent 10 years clawing my way out of the dirt. I built this." He gestured vaguely to the house. "The empire. I built it by being entirely detached. I didn't care who lived, who died, who went bankrupt. I kept my books clean and my hands dirty. I was perfect." His hand slid up her neck, his long fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. He tilted her head up, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "And then I found you sitting in the rain," he whispered. The rawness in his voice made Tessa's breath catch. It wasn't a confession of love, it was a confession of defeat. "I can't undo it," Gideon continued, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I can't unsee it. When Donovan called and said you were missing from the hotel, for the first time in my miserable life, my hands shook." He lifted his right hand, showing her the slight tremor in his fingers. "You made me weak, Tessa. You gave them a target. Then let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me take Clara and leave the city. You don't owe me anything. You don't have to carry this. I am never letting you go." The words weren't a threat. They were a vow. Heavy, absolute, unbreakable. Gideon stepped into her space, completely erasing the distance between them. The scent of him, smoke, rain, and dark danger, wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. "You hate the blood," he said, his mouth an inch from hers. "You hate the violence. You balance the books so you don't have to look at what I do in the dark. But this is the dark, Tessa. This is what buys the safety. This is what keeps the monsters away. I am the monster." Tessa looked up into his eyes. She saw the violence there. She saw the ruthlessness. But beneath it, buried deep in the bedrock of the man, she saw an absolute, terrifying devotion. He would kill for her. He would burn the city to ashes to keep her breathing. She wasn't a naive girl. She knew the cost of staying. She knew that by accepting his protection, she was accepting the blood on his hands. She was stepping out of the light and into the shadows. Tessa reached up, her hands, small and pale, flattened against the hard, tailored chest of his suit. She felt the heavy, steady thud of his heart beneath the silk and wool. She didn't push him away. She gripped the lapels of his jacket and pulled. Gideon groaned, a harsh, guttural sound of surrender, and brought his mouth down hard on hers. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, bruising, tasting of fear, adrenaline, and possessive relief. Gideon's arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor, crushing her against him, as if he were trying to press her directly into his bones. Tessa anchored her hands in his hair, kissing him back with a fierce, answering desperation. She let the last remnants of her old life shatter, allowing the darkness to swallow her whole. The secretary was dead. When Gideon finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing heavily. He didn't put her down. He held her against his chest, his face buried in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin like oxygen. "You stay here," he murmured against her skin. "You run my life. You run my empire. No more glass walls, Tessa. No more hiding behind a desk." Tessa closed her eyes, wrapping her arms tight around his neck. The house around them was cold, silent, and fortified. Outside, the city was full of men who wanted them dead. But as the king of the underworld held her in the center of his fortress, Tessa realized she wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. She owned the monster in it. Did the shift from a cold boardroom to a brutal, protective romance leave you breathless? Tessa didn't just survive the underworld. She became the bedrock of the man who rules it. If you loved watching Gideon tear down his own walls to keep her safe, make sure to hit that like button. Let me know in the comments, do you think Tessa will eventually take over the empire herself? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more dark, gritty, and fiercely protective mafia romances. Share this with your friends, and I'll see you in the next story.